In the early years of the 18th century, long before the borders of modern North America were clearly drawn, the continent was already a battlefield shaped by ambition, fear, and imperial rivalry. And Queen Anne's War did not begin with the firing of the first musket, but with a quiet build-up of tension that had been growing for decades beneath the surface of colonial life. Imagine scattered English settlements stretching along the Atlantic coast, fragile communities carved out of forests and wilderness, while to the north and west French-controlled territories pressed steadily downward from Canada, connected by rivers, forts, and alliances with Native American tribes who knew the land far better than any European power ever could. Across the ocean, European politics were in turmoil. In 1701, the death of the Spanish king without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive struggle over who would control one of Europe's most powerful empires. Great Britain and France, already bitter rivals, found themselves on opposite sides once again, and as always, their conflict did not stay confined to European battlefields. When Queen Anne ascended the British throne in 1702, war between Britain and France became inevitable, and the North American colonies were drawn directly into a global struggle they had little control over but would suffer deeply from. For the colonists living in English America, Queen Anne's War was not fought in grand formations with polished uniforms and massive armies. It was a war of fear, surprise, and survival. British leaders in London viewed North America as a secondary theatre, yet its strategic importance was undeniable. Control of trade routes, fishing grounds, fur markets, and defensive frontiers meant everything to the future of empire. France had built a strong network stretching from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley, effectively hemming in the English colonies along the coast. French officials understood that they did not need to conquer English settlements outright. Instead, they relied on smaller, fast-moving forces supported by Native American allies to keep the English colonies weak, divided, and constantly under threat. These alliances were not accidental. French traders and missionaries had spent decades building relationships with tribes such as the Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, and others, offering trade goods, military support, and mutual protection against English expansion. As war loomed, the English colonies were deeply unprepared for what was coming. Their militias were poorly trained, underfunded, and often divided by local politics and rivalries between colonies. New England, New York, and the southern colonies all had different priorities, and cooperation was difficult. British military aid was limited, and colonial governors frequently argued over resources while frontier settlements remained dangerously exposed. For families living near the northern frontier, especially in New England and along the New York border, life became a constant state of anxiety. A quiet village at dusk could turn into a scene of terror before dawn. French-led raiding parties, often composed largely of native warriors, struck without warning, burning homes, killing settlers, and capturing prisoners who were sometimes taken hundreds of miles away into Canada. These raids were not random acts of violence. They were deliberate strategies designed to break morale, disrupt expansion, and remind English colonists that their presence on the land was contested. At the same time, the British were forced to think defensively rather than offensively. Their main concern was protecting key population centers and economic hubs. Charleston, South Carolina, though far from the northern frontier, was vulnerable to French and Spanish threats from Florida and the Caribbean, forcing British resources to be spread thin across a vast territory. In the north, New York and New England represented the front line of imperial conflict, yet they lacked the unified command necessary to mount decisive campaigns against French strongholds. Colonial leaders dreamed of capturing Quebec or Montreal, believing that such victories would end the threat once and for all, but these plans rarely advanced beyond paper. Poor coordination, harsh weather, disease, and limited supplies repeatedly undermined British efforts. The political reality behind Queen Anne's War was harsh and unforgiving. In Europe, the war was about dynasties, crowns, and balance of power. In North America, it was about land, survival, and control of the future. English settlers pushed steadily westward, clearing land and establishing farms, while French authorities sought to preserve their trade networks and influence among native nations. Native American tribes themselves were not passive participants. They made strategic choices based on which alliance best protected their interests, lands, and people. For many tribes, aligning with the French offered a way to resist English encroachment, but it also pulled them deeper into a European war that would leave lasting scars on their communities. As 1702 turned into 1703, the war officially reached North American shores, and the fragile peace that had allowed colonial life to continue was shattered. Frontier settlements became militarized zones, churches doubled as forts, and ordinary men were transformed into soldiers almost overnight. Women and children lived with the constant threat of attack, and rumors of raids traveled faster than any official news. Every snapped branch in the forest, every unfamiliar footprint in the snow, carried the possibility of death. Queen Anne's War had begun not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow tightening of fear around the colonies, a realization that they were now pawns in a much larger struggle. This opening phase set the tone for a conflict that would be brutal, unpredictable, and deeply personal, shaping the lives of thousands and redefining the balance of power in North America for generations to come. As Queen Anne's War moved beyond its opening phase, the conflict intensified into a relentless struggle that transformed daily life across the northern English colonies into a cycle of anticipation and terror, where the war was not defined by single decisive battles but by a series of brutal encounters that left deep psychological and physical scars. By 1704, French commanders in Canada had fully embraced a strategy of frontier warfare, understanding that the English colonies could be weakened more effectively through constant pressure rather than large-scale invasions. Small bands of French soldiers, often accompanied by Native American warriors, moved swiftly through forests and frozen rivers, striking isolated settlements that lacked proper defenses. One of the most infamous moments came when the village of Deerfield in Massachusetts was attacked before dawn. Homes were set ablaze, families were dragged from their beds, and the dead were left behind in the snow, while captives were forced on exhausting marches northward. News of such attacks spread rapidly, not only magnifying fear but also shaping how colonists understood the war itself, as something intimate and inescapable rather than distant and abstract. The English response to these raids revealed the weaknesses within the colonial system. Militias were called up repeatedly, but many men were farmers and laborious with limited training, forced to leave their fields and families behind. Supplies were inconsistent, weapons were outdated, and coordination between colonies was often slow or non-existent. Governors issued urgent requests to London for additional troops and funding, yet Britain's attention remained largely fixed on Europe, where massive armies clashed over royal succession. As a result, colonial leaders were left to improvise, fortifying towns, building blockhouses along the frontier, and attempting to create early warning systems using scouts and patrols. Despite these efforts, the sheer size of the frontier made complete defense impossible, and each new raid reinforced the sense that the war could strike anywhere at any time. While New England suffered heavily, New York also became a critical zone of conflict. The region sat between French Canada and the English colonies to the south, making it a strategic corridor for movement and trade. Control of alliances with the Iroquois Confederacy was especially important, as these powerful native nations could tip the balance in favor of either side. Unlike earlier conflicts, the Iroquois largely attempted to remain neutral during Queen Anne's War, recognizing the devastating consequences that full involvement could bring. This neutrality frustrated both British and French officials, but it also highlighted the increasing agency of native nations, who were no longer willing to be drawn blindly into European rivalries. Still, neutrality did not guarantee safety, and Iroquois communities faced pressure, disruption, and occasional violence as both sides maneuvered around their territories. In the midst of this chaos, the human cost of the war grew steadily. Frontier families lived under constant strain, sleeping with weapons close at hand and sending children to safer towns whenever possible. Economic activity slowed as trade routes became dangerous and farmland was abandoned. Entire villages were emptied as settlers fled toward more fortified areas, creating waves of displacement that reshaped the colonial landscape. Captivity became one of the defining experiences of the war. Those taken during raids faced uncertain fates, with some adopted into native communities, others ransomed back to English settlements, and many never returning at all. These stories circulated widely, becoming powerful reminders of the personal risks of living on the edge of empire. Despite these hardships, the English colonies did not remain entirely on the defensive. Colonial leaders recognized that as long as French strongholds in Acadia and along the Canadian frontier remained intact, the raids would continue. Acadia, centered around the fortified town of Port Royal, was particularly significant. From this base, French forces and their allies could threaten New England's coastal settlements and fishing industries, which were vital to the colonial economy. Several early English attempts to capture Port Royal failed due to poor planning, lack of naval support, and disagreements among colonial commanders. These failures were costly, not only in lives and resources but also in morale, reinforcing the belief that the French were entrenched and difficult to dislodge. Yet even in failure, the pressure on both sides increased. French resources were stretched thin as they defended multiple fronts with limited manpower. English colonies, though divided, slowly gained experience and confidence through repeated mobilization. The war began to evolve from scattered defensive actions into a more deliberate effort to weaken French control. This shift was driven as much by necessity as by ambition. Every year the war dragged on meant more burned farms, more lost lives, and more uncertainty about the future. The realization spread that survival alone was not enough. Something had to change to break the cycle of raids and retaliation. By the middle years of Queen Anne's War, the conflict had become a grinding test of endurance. There were no clear victories to celebrate, only moments of temporary relief followed by renewed danger. The wilderness itself seemed to favor those who knew it best, and European-style warfare offered little advantage in such conditions. As winter froze rivers into highways and summer forests provided cover for ambushes, the war took on a rhythm dictated by the land rather than by commanders' plans. This phase of the conflict revealed the true nature of imperial warfare in North America, where control was measured not just in captured territory but in the ability to endure constant pressure. The stage was being set for a decisive shift, one that would finally alter the balance of power and force both empires to reconsider their hold on the continent. As the war dragged deeper into its middle years, the exhaustion felt across the English colonies was matched by a growing determination to strike back in a way that could permanently change the course of Queen Anne's War, and this determination gradually focused on one clear objective that symbolized French power in northeastern North America. Port Royal, the fortified heart of French Acadia, had long stood as a constant threat to New England's security, serving as a base for raids against coastal towns, fishing fleets, and trade routes. By 1709, colonial leaders increasingly believed that as long as Port Royal remained in French hands, peace would never truly return to the frontier. Earlier failures had taught them painful lessons about planning, logistics, and cooperation, and this time the English colonies were determined not to repeat the same mistakes. A new sense of unity emerged, driven by shared suffering and the realization that the war could not be won through defense alone. The renewed campaign against Port Royal was shaped by both local resolve and shifting priorities within the British Empire. Although Britain was still heavily committed to fighting in Europe, the mounting losses in North America could no longer be ignored. Colonial leaders appealed relentlessly to London, arguing that a decisive victory in Acadia would secure the northern frontier and protect vital economic interests. These appeals finally gained traction, and limited but crucial naval and military support was authorized. Unlike earlier expeditions, the plan to capture Port Royal in 1710 was marked by clearer leadership and better coordination between colonial forces and the British Navy. Troops from New England assembled with a sense of purpose that had been missing in previous years, aware that this operation represented more than just another raid. It was a chance to reshape the balance of power in the region. When the English fleet appeared off the coast of Acadia, the psychological impact alone was immense. Port Royal's defenders, already weakened by years of isolation, shortages, and limited reinforcements from France, faced a well-organized siege rather than a disjointed assault. Artillery was positioned methodically, and the surrounding area was secured to prevent relief forces from intervening. The siege unfolded over several tense days, marked by steady bombardment and careful maneuvering rather than chaotic violence. For the French garrison, the reality was grim. Supplies were low, morale was fragile, and the hope of rescue was fading with each passing hour. When the decision to surrender was finally made, it marked a turning point not only in the war but in the history of the region itself. The fall of Port Royal in 1710 sent shockwaves across North America. French-ruled Acadia was transformed into the British province of Nova Scotia, fundamentally altering the political and military landscape. For English colonists, the victory provided a rare sense of triumph and validation after years of hardship. Coastal settlements experienced a noticeable reduction in raids, and the fishing industry, so vital to New England's economy, gained a degree of stability it had not known since the war began. Yet the victory also carried complex consequences. French settlers in Acadia found themselves living under British rule, facing uncertainty about their land, rights, and future. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, laying the groundwork for future conflicts that would erupt in later decades. Despite this major success, Queen Anne's War was far from over. The capture of Port Royal weakened French influence in the region but did not eliminate it entirely. French forces continued to operate from Canada, and frontier raids, though reduced, did not disappear. The war expanded into a contest of endurance, with both sides struggling to maintain momentum as resources dwindled. Disease, harsh winters, and supply shortages took a heavy toll on soldiers and civilians alike. The financial burden of constant mobilization strained colonial economies, leading to increased taxes and growing discontent among settlers who questioned how long the war could continue. In this phase of the conflict, the scale of loss became more apparent. Thousands of lives were disrupted, not only through death but through displacement and economic ruin. Farms left untended fell into decay, trade networks collapsed, and entire communities were reshaped by the absence of those who never returned from raids or campaigns. The psychological toll was equally severe. A generation of colonists grew up knowing little but war, their memories shaped by alarms, fortifications, and the constant presence of danger. For Native American communities, the consequences were even more devastating. Alliances forged for survival drew them deeper into European conflicts that brought disease, population decline, and internal divisions that weakened their long-term position. As years passed, it became increasingly clear that neither Britain nor France could sustain the war indefinitely in North America without a broader resolution in Europe. The conflict on the continent remained tied to the larger War of the Spanish Succession, and developments overseas would ultimately determine the fate of colonial possessions. Still, the middle years of Queen Anne's War had already accomplished something irreversible. They demonstrated that control of North America would not be decided solely by distant kings and treaties, but by the ability of empires and colonies to adapt, endure, and strike decisively when opportunity arose. The fall of Port Royal stood as proof that the balance of power could shift, even in a war defined by uncertainty, and it set the stage for the final phase of the conflict, where diplomacy and exhaustion would finally bring the fighting to an end. As the war entered its final stretch, the momentum created by the fall of Port Royal slowly gave way to a quieter but equally consequential phase, where exhaustion, loss, and political calculation began to overshadow open combat across North America. By 1711, both British and French forces were struggling under the weight of a conflict that had lasted nearly a decade, draining treasuries, manpower, and public patience on both sides of the Atlantic. In the English colonies, there was a growing sense that the war had already taken more than it could ever repay. While coastal areas enjoyed a measure of relief after the capture of Acadia, frontier communities remained vulnerable, and the scars of earlier raids had not healed. Many settlements never fully recovered, their populations reduced or permanently displaced, leaving behind abandoned fields and ruined homes that stood as silent reminders of the war's cost. British leaders briefly considered pushing their advantage further by launching a decisive campaign against Canada itself, believing that the capture of Quebec or Montreal could end French power in North America once and for all. In 1711, a large expedition was organized with significant naval support, reflecting a rare moment when imperial attention aligned with colonial ambitions. Yet this effort ended in disaster before it could achieve its objective. Poor navigation, treacherous waters, and inadequate planning led to shipwrecks and heavy loss of life, forcing the expedition to turn back in humiliation. The failure reinforced a hard truth that had defined much of Queen Anne's War. Even when resources were finally committed, success was never guaranteed in the harsh and unpredictable environment of North America. For the colonies, this defeat was demoralizing, a stark reminder that the war could still inflict painful losses even in its later years. As military operations slowed, diplomacy increasingly took center stage. In Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession was approaching its own conclusion, and the major powers began negotiating an end to hostilities that had exhausted entire nations. These negotiations would determine not only the fate of European thrones but also the future of colonial empires overseas. For North America, the outcome would reshape borders and influence for generations. Colonial leaders followed these talks closely, aware that decisions made thousands of miles away would define their security and prosperity long after the fighting stopped. Despite the distance, the voices of the colonies mattered, as Britain recognized that its growing presence in North America was becoming central to its imperial identity. When the Treaties of Utrecht were finalized in 1713, they marked the official end of Queen Anne's War and delivered sweeping changes to the balance of power in North America. France ceded Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay region to Britain, granting the British Empire control over vital fishing grounds and fur trade routes that had long fueled economic competition. Combined with the earlier capture of Acadia, these gains significantly expanded British influence and weakened France's ability to project power along the Atlantic coast. For the English colonies, the treaties brought a sense of victory and validation, confirming that years of sacrifice had produced tangible results. Trade flourished in newly secured regions, and the threat of constant coastal raids diminished further. Yet peace did not erase the war's profound human cost. The demographic impact was substantial, though often difficult to measure precisely. Thousands of settlers had been killed or captured, and many more had lost homes, livelihoods, and family members. The economic toll was immense, with colonies burdened by debt accumulated to fund militias, fortifications, and expeditions. Taxes rose, and tensions grew between colonial governments and the populations they struggled to support. Native American nations bore some of the heaviest losses of all. Caught between rival empires, they suffered population decline from warfare and disease, and their political autonomy was further eroded as European powers redrew borders without their consent. Alliances that had once offered protection now left many tribes isolated and vulnerable in the post-war landscape. The war also left behind a legacy of experience and expectation. English colonists had learned that they could not rely entirely on Britain for protection, fostering a growing sense of self-reliance that would shape future conflicts. They had built militias, organized defenses, and coordinated campaigns on a scale previously unknown, gaining confidence in their ability to influence the outcome of imperial struggles. At the same time, the war reinforced a deep-seated mistrust of French intentions and a belief that peace with France was temporary at best. This mindset would persist, setting the stage for future wars that would erupt later in the century. By the time the last echoes of Queen Anne's War faded, North America had been irrevocably changed. Borders were redrawn, empires repositioned, and communities reshaped by years of violence and uncertainty. What had begun as a distant European succession crisis had transformed into a defining chapter in colonial history, proving that the fate of continents could hinge on decisions made far beyond their shores. The war's final years may have been quieter in terms of battles, but their consequences were lasting, embedding the memory of conflict into the identity of the colonies and ensuring that the struggle for control of North America was far from over, even as an uneasy peace settled across the land. When Queen Anne's War finally came to an end, its true significance only began to reveal itself in the years that followed, as the echoes of nearly 11 years of conflict continued to shape the future of North America in ways that few at the time could fully comprehend. The treaties signed in Europe may have silenced the guns, but they did not erase the tensions, memories, or ambitions that the war had intensified across the continent. For the English colonies, the outcome of the war confirmed a powerful truth. Survival and expansion in North America were no longer distant dreams but achievable realities, secured through sacrifice, resilience, and a growing sense of collective identity. At the same time, the war left behind an undercurrent of instability, as old rivalries remained unresolved and new ones quietly formed beneath the surface of apparent peace. British control over Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay region dramatically altered the strategic map of North America. These territories provided access to rich fisheries, lucrative fur trade networks, and key transportation routes that strengthened Britain's economic and military position. English merchants and investors quickly moved to capitalize on these gains, increasing trade and settlement in newly secured areas. Yet expansion brought new challenges. British authorities now faced the complex task of governing diverse populations, including French settlers and Native American communities whose loyalties were uncertain. Efforts to impose British laws, customs, and religious practices created friction, particularly in Acadia, where French inhabitants struggled to adapt to life under a new empire. This uneasy coexistence foreshadowed future conflicts that would erupt when imperial interests once again collided. The human cost of Queen Anne's War remained deeply etched into colonial society. Families who had endured years of fear carried those memories forward, shaping how communities viewed security and leadership. Veterans returned to civilian life bearing physical and emotional wounds, their experiences influencing local politics and attitudes toward future military service. Widows, orphans, and displaced families relied on fragile systems of support that were often overwhelmed by the scale of loss. The war had not only taken lives but had also altered the social fabric of the colonies, creating a population more accustomed to hardship and more alert to the dangers of frontier life. For Native American nations, the war's end offered little relief. Although some tribes had gained temporary advantages through alliances, the long-term consequences were overwhelmingly negative. Population decline, loss of territory, and weakening political autonomy left many communities vulnerable to further encroachment. European powers continued to negotiate borders without native consent, accelerating a process that would increasingly marginalize indigenous voices. Queen Anne's War demonstrated that native nations were indispensable participants in imperial conflicts, yet their sacrifices were rarely rewarded when peace was declared. This imbalance would fuel resentment and resistance in future decades, as indigenous communities fought to preserve their lands and ways of life. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of the war was the change it sparked in the mindset of the English colonists themselves. They had witnessed firsthand how decisions made in distant European courts could plunge their lives into chaos, and they had learned that imperial protection came with limits. This realization encouraged greater cooperation between colonies and fostered early ideas of shared interests and mutual defense. While loyalty to Britain remained strong, it was now tempered by experience, as colonists understood that their survival often depended on their own initiative. These lessons would echo loudly in later conflicts, influencing how colonial leaders approached war, governance, and their relationship with the British Crown. Queen Anne's War also set the stage for an almost continuous cycle of conflict in North America. Though peace followed in 1713, it was fragile and temporary. The rivalry between Britain and France was far from settled, and both empires continued to strengthen their positions, preparing for the next inevitable clash. The war had proven that North America was not a peripheral theater but a central prize in the struggle for global power. Each fort built, each trade route secured, and each alliance formed brought the continent closer to becoming the decisive battleground of empire in the decades to come. In reflecting on Queen Anne's War, it becomes clear that it was more than a colonial side conflict to a European war. It was a turning point that reshaped borders, hardened attitudes, and revealed the true stakes of imperial competition in the New World. The war showed how global politics could reach into the lives of ordinary settlers, transforming farms into front lines and villages into fortresses. It demonstrated the brutal reality of frontier warfare and the enduring consequences of decisions made in the pursuit of power. If you are finding accurate and meaningful historical insight through our videos, make sure to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and pressing the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war history series, where we continue to explore the battles, strategies, and human stories that shape the world we live in today.